Hi and welcome to this video on writing an essay. Today we're going to look at how to plan an essay. Now before you start watching, please just be aware that the examples that I'm using for this video are drawn from a particular specification, which is AQA English Literature B, and we'll be looking at protest questions. If you don't do that particular specification, that's absolutely fine. The information in the video is still going to be useful for you, and it will hopefully still make sense even if you haven't read the text that we're going to be talking about today, because what I'm going to be focusing on is the different strategies that you can use, and you can apply this across all sorts of different scenarios in your A-level English literature. So in terms of my method of planning then, I tend to do three things as I'm getting ready to write an essay. Of course, you've got to do this quite quickly, especially if you're in an exam situation, and there's quite a lot to cover. So practice makes perfect in this particular situation, and there's loads and loads of example essay questions on my website and obviously on the AQA website as well. So the first thing I would do is a brain dump. That means I would write down everything I can remember that relates to the question. I wouldn't do this in loads of detail, but I'd be writing down keywords in order to prompt my memory. Obviously, this wouldn't be in any kind of order, it would just be as I remember things. So then after that, I would refine that information. So I would look for patterns, or I'd look for an order that I would use to give a bit of shape to my essay. There's kind of four different ways that I would think about giving that order, and I've got them listed on the screen here. So the first one's chronological, so doing it in the order that the text appears, so looking at the beginning, middle and end of the text. The second one is thematic, so for example, the text might have a theme of class consciousness or class conflict, it might have a theme of gender inequality, and it might have a theme to do with ethnicity and racism. So I might structure my answer around those three different themes. I might also look at an argument, so building an argument, challenging that argument, and then finding a middle ground. And you might also be asked a question on two different texts and linking those together. So depending on what the question is, I will pick which one of those strategies is the most appropriate, and you'll have your favourites too. You might know that you gravitate towards writing an essay in a chronological way, but that occasionally using an argument structure is going to work better for you. So you might use that in some circumstances. So don't feel like you have to use one of these more than the other, but think about the question when you've got it in front of you and think about which method is going to be most appropriate to answering that question. The final thing that I would do if I'm planning an essay, which I don't think a lot of people do, but I think it's really useful, is writing an anchor statement, and I'll talk about that a little bit later and what that means and why I think that can help. So let's look at a question first. This one's about the kite runner, so just take a few seconds to read the question on the screen. So what we can see is that the question has a statement about the novel, about a theme from the novel. It's asking to what extent you agree with this, and it's prompting us to remember to analyse the text, so to think about authorial methods, language techniques, structural techniques, all that kind of thing. So the that I'm going to show you for planning is the chronological one. And the first thing I'm going to do is brain dump my ideas. And I'm thinking chronologically, so from the start of the novel, ideas of guilt and shame we see initially on page 1 with Amir's lasting burden of guilt. Then we see that Hosseini establishes Amir's privilege. That's one of the key words in our question. After that, we see Hosseini establishing Asef's privilege, but interestingly, this is not associated with guilt in any way. Moving on to the middle of the novel, I can remember that Hosseini reveals how privilege allows those with money and influence to flee the Russian occupation. Then we have the theme of male privilege in contrast to women's lack of privilege. And at the end of the novel, we have an idea of a lack of privilege, so powerlessness, which actually leads to a sense of shame for Sohrab. So that would counteract what we have in the question. We also know that Hosseini reinforces how Asef's privilege is not connected to shame at that point, but Hosseini does provide a sense of hope for the future as Amir finds redemption and is able to use his privilege for good. Now, this list I've done to help you kind of see what my ideas are. I'd probably not write it in as much detail if I was sitting in an exam, but I wanted you to be able to see my. So So what I've done now is I've moved my list to the side because I'm going to write my plan, and I've gone through and I've highlighted the key words for this. And highlighting is going to help me to find a thread or a line of argument, something that's going to be the backbone of my essay. Of course, I'm working chronologically in this plan, so I'm going to start with the beginning of the novel, where Hosseini establishes the privilege of the Pashtun characters, so looking at Amir and Asif. Then I'm going to link privilege to the idea of shame for Amir, but to power for Asif. Moving on to the middle of the text, I'm going to focus on the idea of gender, so male privilege and women's lack of privilege. You can see that there's little bits of counter argument in here, so women's lack of privilege can also create shame. Then I've got the end of the text looking at the circular structure. That brings us back to Amir and Asif and how Amir finally finds redemption and uses privilege for good. So again, this is a little bit more detailed than what I would probably do in an exam, but it's just to help you to see my thinking. Now, the final thing I would do, and I would write this out if I was in an exam, so this is the level of detail that I would do in an exam situation, is write my anchor statement. An anchor statement is a sentence or two sentences that summarises your argument. I would write this at the top of my exam paper and I'd highlight it. It's not part of my essay, but what I can do is I can continually reflect back on this statement as I'm writing my essay, and just that helps me to check that I'm keeping everything in line with that. And if I find myself deviating from this statement, I can pull myself back as I'm writing my essay. So the anchor statement for this question is that Hosseini presents privilege as an inevitable aspect of social hierarchy, although shame is not. And Hosseini reveals how individuals need to find a way of using privilege for good. So as I say, when I'm writing my introduction, when I'm writing my conclusion, when I'm writing the start of each paragraph where I'm setting out my argument, I would be looking back at that anchor statement and just using it to check that I'm keeping my argument in line with that. Okay, so let's have a look at another example question then. So this one is to explore the significance of elements in social and political protest in this extract. Remember to include in your answer relevant detailed analysis of the ways the author has shaped meanings. Now, this particular question relates to an extract from Bleak House. If you want to read that extract, the details are there at the bottom of the screen, so go onto my blog and you can download a copy of it. Okay, so the extract from Bleak House, which hopefully you know anyway, is by Dickens, and it's a great satirical critique of the system. And I'm going to plan this essay in a thematic way. So brain dumping my ideas first, the extract talks to us about upper class privilege. It talks about the marginalisation of the working classes. We see the maintenance of power through the legal system, the spread of corruption, the motif of infection, present tense reflecting that continual unchanging situation, satirical critique of power structures as well. So I've jotted down all of my ideas. Oh, sorry, forgot one there. No opportunity for rebellion in the text. So I've got ideas, and then the next thing I'm going to do is just use a highlighter to go through and pick out the key ideas. So you can see here that I've highlighted upper class privilege, marginalisation, power, corruption, unchanging, power, no rebellion. And these are going to help me to create that backbone, that thread of my essay. I'm thinking thematically here, so I'm going to start with the theme of upper class privilege, with the description of the lawyers and maintenance of power through the legal system. Then I'm going to explore the impact of this privilege on society. So we have marginalisation of the working classes, no opportunity for rebellion, spread of corruption, and present tense as well. And then I'm going to look at Dickens's satirical critique of these power structures. Finally, I write my anchor statement again. So even though I'm planning this essay in a thematic instead of a chronological way, I still need that anchor statement to make sure I can reflect back, and it's going to keep me kind of rooted and anchored, I suppose is the word, so that I can make sure that my argument always links together. So Dickens establishes the stranglehold the upper classes and the legal system has over Victorian society, critiquing this through imagery of corruption and the use of satire. Well, then another question is about Tony Harrison. So here, Harrison is more interested in conflict and hostility than resolution and harmony. To what extent do you agree with this view of Harrison's poetry? Remember to include in your answer relevant detailed exploration of Harrison's authorial methods. And again, we've got 25 marks. So this particular question is asking to what extent, and that's making me think to use an argument structure. I don't have to, I could work chronologically through his poems as well, but the argument I think could work quite nicely with this. So I'm starting, as always, by brain dumping my ideas. One of the poems he writes on the course is National Trust. We look at class conflict in that. We look at conflict through language. Another poem that I really love by Harrison is Them and Us. Again, we're looking at class conflict through language. However, what we do see in that poem is that Harrison is trying to find a resolution through the act of writing poetry in a working class voice. So what he's doing in his poems is bringing that accent, that dialect, that experience of working class life into what could be regarded as the elite genre of poetry. So we do potentially see that Harrison tries to find that idea of resolution. Looking at the poem Working, another wonderful poem, we see class conflict, we see disenfranchisement, we see mistreatment of the working classes and silencing and a real lack of hope for the future. And then because I'm writing about poems, I probably want to cover 3 or 4 poems in my answer. I'm going to think about V and the impact of class conflict on young men who feel marginalised and powerless, and also the conflict within oneself. However, in that we see that Harrison is trying to find some resolution through giving a voice to the voiceless. However, again, his own education and life choices has taken him away from this experience. So will that poetic voice ever be sufficiently authentic? So what you can see here is a really good example of where I've brain dumped my ideas, and there's so many of them and so many kind of counter arguments coming in that I might quite easily get lost in those complexities. What you need to do again is to use the same method. So I'm highlighting my key ideas. And you can see that I've used 2 different colours here. So blue, I've highlighted my main line of argument, and then green, I've picked out what that counter argument might be. So my first paragraph then in my plan is to build that main line of argument, and I'm going to do that through looking at the poem National Trust. Then I'm going to develop that line of argument through looking at Working. I'm going to challenge, so here I'm going to pull out those green ideas. I'm going to challenge using Them and Us. I'm going to talk about how it does show class conflict. However, we also see Harrison trying to find some kind of resolution. I'm going to resolve this, and this idea of resolving is really important because we've built our main argument, we've developed our main argument, and then we've moved over to the other side with our challenge. If we left our essay there, it would seem a little bit odd, wouldn't it? Our argument would get quite confused. Our reader might wonder what it is that we're trying to communicate about Harrison's poetry. So this idea of resolving is finding some kind of middle ground between the main argument and the challenge, or completely debunking our challenge and saying, no, the main argument is correct. So I'm going to start my resolve paragraph by saying that ultimately Harrison does feel conflicted as he wants to give a voice to the voiceless, but he feels that his writing is insufficiently authentic. So I'm drawing both lines of argument together here and finding that middle ground between them, and then going back to the main argument to show that actually it's this class conflict that dominates. For this kind of argument, I think that anchor statement is absolutely crucial because it's quite complex and it could be quite easy to lose your way as you're writing your essay. So just take a moment to read my anchor statement there on the screen. Okay, so I've got that anchor statement at the top of my essay. I'm going to highlight it, not part of my essay, but it's going to help me to reflect back and to make sure I'm keeping my essay in line with that. So it's coherent and logical as we go through. Final example then, and this is where you might be asked to write about 2 different texts. So just take a moment to read the question. So as we say, we're looking at here, and I'm going to look at Hosseini's The Kite Runner, and I'm going to look at Tony Harrison as well. So brain dumping my ideas first, we see conflict, ethnic conflict in The Kite Runner. We see Hassan's slingshot, so that rebellion against oppression which brings conflict. We see gender conflict in the text. In Tony Harrison, we see class conflict, we see silencing, we see brutal punishments, and we also see that rebellion against oppression as well. So what we see here is that, again, I've just moved all of my brain dump to the side, I've used a highlighter to pick out the key ideas, and then I'm going to plan my essay. So we're going to start with Hosseini the Kite Runner, and I'm doing this thematically. You could also do this in a chronological way as well, just my brain works better in a thematic way. And then I'm going to look at Tony Harrison's poetry, and again I'm going to pull out the key themes of that. So I'm dealing with each writer separately here, and then within that separate section I'm almost doing a little mini essay with that thematic order. You could use the chronological or the argument order within your separate sections if you want to. And then writing my anchor statement. So both writers suggest that conflict is an inevitable aspect of society, and that this arises as individuals rebel against unjust and oppressive hierarchical systems. Just to sum up then, these are my 3 steps that I would use when I'm planning an essay. I'd brain dump my ideas, I'd refine them using one of these 4 methods here, whichever method fits my thinking best or fits the question best. And then I write my anchor statement that I can use to anchor my essay as I'm writing it. Now, all of this in this video has taken me quite a long time to put together. However, in the exam, you need to be able to work quickly. So this should take you really no more than about 5 minutes. Keep your notes really brief. I've put them out in quite a lot of detail on my slides here to show my thinking, but use keywords, use acronyms or shortened versions of words that you kind of develop during your revision and during your practice. And as I say, keep it really, really brief, because you want to move on to writing the actual essay, because that's where you're going to pick up your marks. The next video I'm going to do is about how to write introductions, so make sure you check back and have a look at that. And there's lots and lots of revision resources on my blog, which is amysmithliterature.wordpress.com, so you can go there and you can download what you need to help you prepare for your exams. Thanks very much, folks. See you next video.